The dawn mist clung to the rolling hills of Nebraska like a whispered secret, and Thomas Crawford had always been a man who listened to whispers. As he guided his horse through the narrow path between towering cornstalks, the September air carried something unusual, a sound that didn't belong to the rhythm of his morning rounds. It wasn't the rustle of wind through grain or the distant lowing of cattle. It was softer, more human, like the gentle cooing of a dove mixed with something he couldn't quite place. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas had been managing the Riverside Ranch for 12 years, ever since old Henrik Larsen had taken a chance on a drifter, with calloused hands and honest eyes. The ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime Nebraska farmland, where corn grew tall as church steeples and the Platte River wound like a silver ribbon through emerald pastures. It was honest work for an honest wage, and Thomas had found something resembling peace in the predictable cycles of planting, tending, and harvest. But this morning felt different. The air hummed with an energy he couldn't name, and his horse, a steady chestnut mare named Patience, kept tossing her head and prancing sideways as if she sensed something her rider had yet to understand. Thomas had learned to trust the instincts of both horses and the land during his 38 years, 20 of which had been spent working ranches from Montana to Texas. When something felt off, it usually was. The sound came again, clearer now, definitely human and definitely distressed. Thomas urged Patience forward, pushing through a particularly dense section of corn where the stalks grew so thick they formed natural walls on either side of the irrigation channel. The morning sun slanted through the green canopy above, creating a cathedral of light and shadow that made everything seem both sacred and secretive. What he found in the small clearing ahead would stay with him for the rest of his life. She was curled on her side in a makeshift nest of dried corn husks and wild grass, her dark hair fanned across the earth like spilled ink. But she wasn't alone. Nestled against her were two small forms. Babies, Thomas realized with a shock that made his breath catch in his throat. Twins, by the look of them, maybe 8 or 9 months old, sleeping peacefully despite their unconventional bedroom, and standing guard over this unlikely family, its iridescent tail feathers catching the morning light like stained glass, was a peacock. The magnificent bird fixed Thomas with one bright, intelligent eye, then let out a low, warning call that seemed to say, "Stranger, state your business." The woman stirred at the sound, and Thomas found himself looking into the most striking pair of green eyes he'd ever seen. They were the color of new spring grass, bright with intelligence and wariness in equal measure. For a moment, neither of them moved. Thomas sat frozen in his saddle, trying to process the impossibility of the scene before him. The woman seemed to be taking his measure just as carefully, her arms instinctively tightening around the two babies who were now beginning to wake, making soft, mewling sounds like kittens seeking their mother. "Please," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse from what must have been a cold night in the open air. "Please, don't turn us away." Thomas dismounted slowly, keeping his movements careful and non-threatening. The peacock, which he now noticed was missing several tail feathers and had a slight limp in its left leg, continued to watch him with the intensity of a seasoned guard dog. The woman struggled to sit up, and Thomas could see that her dress, once probably a respectable traveling outfit, was now torn and stained with mud and corn silk. Her feet were bare, and he could see scratches on her arms and face from pushing through the stalks. "Ma'am," Thomas said gently, his voice carrying the soft drawl he'd picked up during his years in Texas. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" She looked down at the babies, then back up at him, and Thomas saw a flash of something fierce and protective cross her features. "We got nowhere else to go," she said simply. "Train left us in Kearney 3 days ago when I couldn't pay the full fare to California. Been walking since then, following the river. Last night the babies were so tired, and it was getting cold, and this seemed like—" She gestured helplessly at the corn around them. "Like shelter." One of the babies, a little girl with her mother's dark hair, began to fuss, and the woman immediately shifted to comfort her, revealing that the other child, a boy, was awake, but content to observe this strange new person who had disrupted their morning. The peacock settled its feathers but remained alert, and Thomas noticed that it wore a small leather collar around its neck, suggesting it wasn't wild, but rather a companion. "What's your name?" Thomas asked. crouching down to bring himself closer to their level. "Sarah," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Sarah Mitchell. These are my children, Emma and Daniel. And this," she gestured to the Peacock, "is Wellington. He belonged to my late husband." Thomas nodded, filing away the slight pause that suggested there was more to that story than she was telling. "I'm Thomas Crawford. I work for the man who owns this land. How long since you've eaten?" Sarah's cheeks flushed pink, and she looked away. "We had some bread yesterday morning. Wellington managed to find some grasshoppers and seeds. But the babies—" She trailed off, and Thomas could see the weight of responsibility and desperation in her shoulders. He stood up, decision crystallizing in his mind with the clarity that came from years of making quick choices in difficult situations. "Can you walk?" Sarah nodded, though Thomas noticed she winced as she shifted to stand. The babies, now fully awake, seemed remarkably calm for children who had spent the night outdoors. The little boy, Daniel, even offered Thomas a toothless grin that reminded him powerfully of his younger brother back in Missouri. "Then we're going to the ranch house," Thomas said. "Mrs. Larsen will want to get some food in you and those babies, and we'll figure out what comes next after that." "I can't pay you," Sarah said quickly. "I mean, I don't have any money right now, but I can work. I'm good with animals, and I can cook and clean and mend. I won't be a burden, I promise." Thomas was already gathering the few belongings he could see scattered around their makeshift camp. A small cloth bag, a baby's rattle, what looked like the remains of a loaf of bread wrapped in brown paper. "Ma'am, anybody who can keep 2 babies alive sleeping rough in a cornfield for 3 days isn't going to be a burden to anyone. Come on." But before they could take more than a few steps, the sound of approaching horses made them all freeze. Thomas counted at least 3 riders, maybe 4, coming fast through the corn. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle secured to his saddle, and he noticed Sarah's face go pale as parchment. "Sarah," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the direction of the approaching sound, "is there something you need to tell me about why you're really out here?" Before she could answer, the riders burst into the clearing. Thomas recognized the lead man immediately. Marcus Webb, the sheriff of Buffalo County. A decent man, but one who took his job seriously. Behind him rode 2 of his deputies, and, to Thomas's surprise, a well-dressed stranger in a black suit who looked distinctly out of place on horseback. "Morning, Thomas," Sheriff Webb said, tipping his hat but keeping his eyes on Sarah and the children. "We're looking for a woman traveling with twin babies. Got a wire yesterday from the authorities in Iowa. Sarah Mitchell wanted for questioning in connection with the death of her husband." Sarah's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. The Peacock, sensing the tension, spread its damaged tail in a display that would have been magnificent if not for the missing feathers. Thomas felt the world shift around him, the morning's simple act of charity suddenly becoming something far more complicated. "That her?" Webb asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The man in the black suit urged his horse forward. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm Detective Harrison, from the Pottawatomie County Sheriff's Department. You've been a difficult woman to find." Sarah stood straighter, and Thomas saw steel enter her spine despite the fear in her eyes. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said clearly, "and my children need care, not more traveling." "That's for a judge to decide," Harrison replied. "You ran from questioning, which makes you look guilty of something, and there are questions about your husband's death that need answering." Thomas found himself stepping slightly forward, positioning himself between the mounted men and Sarah. It was an unconscious movement, born from instincts he'd developed over years of protecting what mattered. "Now hold on," he said, his voice carrying a calm authority that made even the sheriff pause. "Whatever questions need answering can wait until these babies are fed and this woman has had a chance to rest properly." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "And you are?" "Thomas Crawford. I work this land, and right now, Mrs. Mitchell and her children are my responsibility." "Actually," Sheriff Webb interjected, "they're mine. If there's a warrant—" "Is there?" Thomas asked pointedly. "A warrant, I mean. Or are you just here to ask questions?" The sheriff and the detective exchanged glances, and Thomas caught the slight hesitation that told him everything he needed to know. "Questions, for now," Webb admitted, "but she needs to come with us." Sarah's voice, when she spoke, was steady despite the tremor Thomas could see in her hands. My children haven't eaten since yesterday. They're 8 months old. Whatever questions you have, surely they can wait until they've been cared for." Detective Harrison opened his mouth to object, but Thomas cut him off. "There's a way to handle this that doesn't involve dragging babies around the countryside," he said. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mrs. Mitchell, would you be willing to answer the detective's questions if we could do it somewhere your children could be properly looked after?" Sarah nodded quickly. "Of course. I have nothing to hide." Thomas turned to the sheriff. "Marcus, you know Henrik Larsen's reputation in this county. His word is good as gold, and his wife Maria runs the most respectable household for 50 miles. What if Mrs. Mitchell and her children stayed at the ranch while this gets sorted out? She wouldn't be going anywhere, and Detective Harrison could ask his questions in a civilized manner." Sheriff Webb considered this, clearly recognizing the wisdom in the proposal. Detective Harrison, however, looked less convinced. "This woman fled Iowa in the middle of the night after her husband died under suspicious circumstances. I'm not inclined to trust her on anyone's word." "What kind of suspicious circumstances?" Thomas asked, and he was surprised by the edge in his own voice. Harrison studied him for a moment before answering. "Benjamin Mitchell was found dead in his study, apparently from a blow to the head. Mrs. Mitchell claimed he'd been drinking and fell, hit his head on the fireplace. But there were inconsistencies in her story, and she had significant debts, along with a life insurance policy that would have solved her financial problems." Thomas glanced at Sarah, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. The babies, perhaps sensing their mother's distress, began to fuss again, and Wellington the Peacock let out a sharp protective call. "Sarah," Thomas said gently, "is that true?" She looked up at him, and Thomas saw something in her eyes that looked like gratitude mixed with despair. "Benjamin did die from hitting his head," she said clearly. "But he didn't fall because he was drunk. He fell because he was trying to hit me, and I pushed him away to protect my children." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a gun. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach as the implications of what she'd said became clear. Detective Harrison leaned forward in his saddle, his expression sharpening with interest. "So you admit you pushed him," Harrison said, "which caused him to fall and strike his head, resulting in his death. That's manslaughter at minimum, Mrs. Mitchell." "That's self-defense," Thomas said before Sarah could respond. "If a man is trying to strike a woman, especially one holding babies, she has every right to protect herself and her children." "That's for a jury to decide," Harrison replied, "not a ranch hand." The insult was deliberate, and Thomas felt his temper stir for the first time since the riders had arrived. But before he could respond, Sarah spoke again, her voice growing stronger. "Detective Harrison, my husband was a violent man who drank heavily and regularly threatened me and our children. The night he died, he came home drunk and angry because he'd lost money gambling again. When the baby started crying, he said he was going to teach them to be quiet and picked up a fireplace poker. I stepped between him and their cradle, and when he swung the poker at me, I pushed him as hard as I could. He stumbled backward and hit his head on the stone hearth. I never meant for him to die, but I won't apologize for protecting my children." Sheriff Webb's expression had grown troubled during this recitation. Thomas could see the man's natural sense of justice, warring with his duty to uphold the law. "Mrs. Mitchell," Webb said carefully, "why didn't you tell this to the authorities in Iowa?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Because Benjamin's family owns half the county, and I'm nobody from nowhere, with no money and no connections. His brother is a judge, his uncle is the mayor, and his cousin is the prosecutor I would have faced. They'd already decided I was guilty before Benjamin was even buried. They were planning to take my children away and put me in prison, so I took what little money I had and ran." Thomas found himself believing every word. He'd seen enough small-town politics and family influence to know how justice could be twisted when money and power were involved. But Detective Harrison seemed less convinced. "A convenient story," the detective said. "Unfortunately, running from the law doesn't exactly support your claims of innocence." "Neither does staying to face a rigged system," Thomas replied. "You said yourself there were inconsistencies in her story. What kind of inconsistencies?" Harrison hesitated, and Thomas sensed he'd hit on something important. "Well," the detective said finally, "the medical examiner noted that the wound on Mitchell's head was consistent with a fall, and there were indeed signs of a struggle in the room. But Mrs. Mitchell initially said he'd simply fallen while drunk, not that there had been an altercation." "Because she was scared," Thomas said. "Scared and probably in shock. That doesn't make her a murderer." During this exchange, Sarah had been quietly tending to her children, but Thomas noticed she was listening to every word. When she looked up, her eyes met his, and he saw something there that made his decision for him. "Sheriff," Thomas said, "I'm formally requesting that you allow Mrs. Mitchell to remain at the Larsen Ranch while this matter is investigated further. I'll take personal responsibility for ensuring she doesn't leave the county." "You don't have the authority to make that kind of guarantee," Harrison objected. "Maybe not," Thomas agreed, "but Henrik Larsen does, and his word carries weight with judges and officials all the way to the state capitol. I'm guessing that carries more influence than whatever pull the Mitchell family has in one county in Iowa." Sheriff Webb was nodding slowly. "Thomas has a point, Detective. Henrik Larsen is respected throughout the state, and his ranch is isolated enough that Mrs. Mitchell couldn't disappear without us knowing. It would give us time to investigate her claims properly." "And what about the children?" Thomas pressed. "Even if you don't believe her story, those babies are innocent. They need stability and care, not to be dragged around while adults argue about legal jurisdiction." As if summoned by his words, little Emma began to cry in earnest, a hungry, tired wail that seemed cut through the morning air like a knife. Daniel joined in a moment later, and Sarah looked close to tears herself as she tried to comfort them both with no success. Detective Harrison's expression softened slightly as he watched the scene. Perhaps he had children of his own, or perhaps he simply recognized that whatever Sarah Mitchell might or might not have done, her babies were suffering through no fault of their own. "1 week," he said finally. "Mrs. Mitchell can remain at the ranch for 1 week while I investigate her claims, but she doesn't leave the property, and someone needs to vouch for her character and her story." "I'll vouch for her," Thomas said without hesitation, surprising himself with the speed and certainty of his response. Sheriff Webb raised an eyebrow. "Thomas, you just met this woman 10 minutes ago." "Sometimes 10 minutes is enough," Thomas replied, and he meant it. There was something about Sarah Mitchell, her fierce protectiveness of her children, her willingness to face hardship rather than abandon them, the way she'd stood up straight and told her story despite being outnumbered and outgunned, that resonated with something deep in his chest. Sarah looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Mr. Crawford," she said softly, "you don't know me. You don't know what I might have done or what kind of person I am. Why would you take such a risk?" Thomas met her gaze steadily. "Because," he said, "I know what I see right now. I see a woman who spent 3 days walking with 2 babies and an injured peacock, who made a shelter for them in a cornfield and kept them safe through the night. I see someone who could have abandoned that bird when it was slowing her down, but didn't. And I see someone who's telling the truth, even when it might not be the smart thing to do." Wellington the peacock chose that moment to step closer to Thomas, fixing him with that intelligent gaze before letting out a soft, almost approving sound. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, and Thomas caught a glimpse of something that might have been hope. "Wellington doesn't trust easily," she said quietly. "He was Benjamin's bird originally, but after that night, he wouldn't go near any man. You're the first person he's approached since we left Iowa." Detective Harrison cleared his throat impatiently. "This is all very touching, but I need guarantees. If Mrs. Mitchell runs again, someone needs to be held accountable." "She won't run," Thomas said, with a confidence that surprised even him. "Will you, Sarah?" Sarah looked down at her children, then at Wellington, then back at Thomas. "No," she said firmly. "I won't run. I'm tired of running. If Mr. Crawford and Mr. Larsen are willing to give us sanctuary for a week, then I'll use that time to prove my innocence properly." Sheriff Webb nodded slowly. "All right then, but Detective Harrison will need to speak with you daily, and you'll need to provide a full written statement about what happened that night in Iowa." "I can do that," Sarah agreed. Thomas was already moving toward his horse. Then let's get these babies to the ranch house. Mrs. Larsen will have breakfast ready, and she's raised 5 children of her own. She'll know what Emma and Daniel need. As they prepared to leave the clearing, Thomas found himself walking beside Sarah while she carried the twins. Wellington limped along beside them, occasionally letting out soft calls that seemed almost conversational. The peacock's damaged tail feathers caught the morning light, and Thomas couldn't help but think there was something symbolic about a beautiful creature that had been hurt, but was still magnificent. "Mr. Crawford," Sarah said as they reached the edge of the cornfield, "I need you to know that I may not be innocent of everything. I did push Benjamin, and he did die because of it. If that makes me a murderer in the eyes of the law, then maybe I deserve whatever happens to me." Thomas helped her up onto Patience's broad back, settling her carefully with the babies in her arms while Wellington perched somewhat precariously behind the saddle. "Sarah," he said, looking up at her, "there's a difference between being guilty of something and deserving punishment for it. Sometimes people get put in situations where there are no good choices, only necessary ones." "You sound like you speak from experience," she observed. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I had a younger brother once. Sweet kid, never hurt anyone in his life. But he got mixed up with the wrong people, and when things went bad, I had to make a choice between protecting him and following the letter of the law. I chose my brother, and I've never regretted it, even though it cost me everything I had built in Missouri." "What happened to your brother?" Sarah asked gently. "He got a second chance to build a better life, which is all anyone really deserves," Thomas replied. "And that's what I'm hoping we can get for you and your children." As they made their way through the corn toward the ranch house, Thomas found himself thinking about the strange turn his quiet morning had taken. He'd left the house planning to check the irrigation channels and count cattle. Instead, he was bringing home a woman wanted for questioning in her husband's death, along with twin babies and a wounded peacock. Henrik Larsen was going to have questions, and rightfully so. The man had trusted Thomas with significant responsibility over the years, and now Thomas was asking him to extend that trust to a complete stranger under difficult circumstances. But something about Sarah Mitchell and her small, strange family felt right in a way Thomas couldn't explain. Maybe it was the way she'd protected her children, even when it meant sleeping in a cornfield. Maybe it was the fierce love he'd seen in her eyes when she talked about keeping them safe. Or maybe it was simply that Thomas had learned to recognize when someone needed the kind of second chance he'd been given 12 years ago, when Henrik Larsen had hired a drifter with a past and asked no questions about what that past might contain. Whatever it was, Thomas Crawford had made his choice, and he was prepared to stand by it. The Larsen ranch house sat like a fortress of hospitality against the Nebraska sky, its whitewashed walls and wraparound porch. Speaking of prosperity earned through decades of honest labor, Maria Larsen emerged from the kitchen before Thomas had even helped Sarah down from the horse, her motherly instincts activated by the sight of the babies and their travel-worn mother. Maria was a woman of 53 who had raised 5 children of her own and helped deliver half the babies in Buffalo County. Her graying blonde hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her blue eyes held the kind of warmth that could make strangers feel like family within minutes. She took one look at Sarah's exhausted face and the fussing babies, and immediately shifted into the mode that had made her legendary among the ranch wives of central Nebraska. "Thomas Crawford, what have you brought me?" she asked. But her tone held no criticism, only the gentle authority of a woman accustomed to managing crises large and small. "This is Sarah Mitchell and her children Emma and Daniel," Thomas explained as he helped Sarah dismount. "They've had a rough few days, and they need shelter while some legal matters get sorted out." Maria's keen eyes took in Sarah's torn dress, her bare feet, and the way she held her children with the protective intensity of a mother bear. Wellington the peacock chose that moment to hop down from the horse with an undignified squawk, his damaged tail feathers trailing behind him like a tattered banner of former glory. "And I suppose this magnificent fellow belongs to them as well?" Maria asked, her eyebrows rising as Wellington limped over to stand near Sarah's feet. "This is Wellington," Sarah said, her voice still hoarse from the cold night. "I know he's unusual. If he's a problem, I can try to find somewhere else for him." "Nonsense," Maria interrupted with a wave of her hand. "Henrik has been talking for years about getting some exotic birds for the property. He'll be delighted." Now, let's get you and these babies inside before they catch their death of cold." The interior of the Larsen house reflected the same practical comfort as its exterior. The main room was spacious and warm, with hand-carved furniture that had been built to last for generations. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, and the smell of fresh bread and coffee filled the air. Sarah's stomach growled audibly, and she flushed with embarrassment. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" Maria asked, already moving toward the kitchen. "Day before yesterday," Sarah admitted. "We had some bread yesterday morning, but I was saving most of our food for the children." Maria's expression grew stern. "Child, you can't take care of babies if you don't take care of yourself. Thomas, help her into that chair by the fire. I'll get some warm milk for the little ones and something substantial for their mother." As Thomas guided Sarah to the comfortable armchair, Henrik Larsen entered through the front door. At 62, Henrik was still an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered with silver hair, and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent working under the prairie sun. His pale blue eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing as they took in the unusual scene before him. "Thomas," he said in his slight Norwegian accent, "I saw the sheriff and another man riding away. Is there something I should know about?" Thomas straightened, suddenly aware that he had made commitments on his employer's behalf without asking permission. "Henrik, I need to explain what's happened and ask for your help with something that might be complicated." Henrik's eyebrows rose, but he simply nodded and settled into his own chair, clearly prepared to listen. Thomas found himself grateful, not for the first time, for the older man's steady temperament and willingness to hear a full story before making judgments. As Thomas related the morning's events, Henrik's expression remained neutral, though Sarah noticed his eyes soften slightly when Thomas described finding her and the children sleeping in the cornfield. When Thomas reached the part about Detective Harrison's accusations and the arrangement they had made, Henrik was quiet for a long moment. "So," Henrik said finally, "you have vouched for this woman's character based on 10 minutes of acquaintance, and promised that I would provide her sanctuary while the law decides whether she is a murderess or a victim. Is that an accurate summary?" Sarah felt her cheeks burn with shame. When Henrik put it that way, Thomas's actions seemed foolishly impulsive, and she began to rise from her chair. "Mr. Larsen, I'm sorry. Mr. Crawford was trying to help, but I don't want to impose on your family. If you could just let me rest here for an hour or two, I'll take my children and continue on to California." "Sit down, child," Henrik said gently but firmly. "I was not criticizing Thomas's judgment, merely clarifying the situation. In my experience, a man who can manage 3,000 acres and make sound decisions about cattle and crops for 12 years is probably capable of recognizing character when he sees it." He leaned forward slightly, studying Sarah's face with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading the truth in livestock and weather patterns. "Thomas tells me you pushed your husband in self-defense when he threatened your children. Is this true?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir. Benjamin was drunk and violent, and he was coming at me with a fireplace poker. I pushed him to protect my babies, and he fell and hit his head. I never meant for him to die, but I won't apologize for defending my children." Henrik nodded slowly. "And the Peacock?" The question seemed to surprise Sarah. "Wellington belonged to Benjamin originally. He bought him from a traveling merchant who said peacocks brought good luck and prosperity. But Benjamin lost interest quickly when Wellington didn't immediately make him rich. After Benjamin died, Wellington wouldn't let anyone else near him except me and the children. I couldn't leave him behind to starve." "A creature that can inspire loyalty from a peacock is not without merit," Henrik said with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Maria, what is your opinion?" Maria appeared from the kitchen carrying a tray laden with warm milk, fresh bread, and a bowl of thick beef stew. "My opinion," she said, setting the tray down beside Sarah, "is that this young woman needs food, rest, and time to heal from whatever she's been through. The rest can be sorted out later." She handed Sarah a small bowl of warm milk mixed with honey. "For the babies," she explained. "They're old enough to drink from a cup if you help them. The bread can be soaked in milk to make it easier for them to manage." As Sarah fed her children, Henrik continued his quiet assessment. He watched the way she attended to Emma and Daniel's needs before her own, the gentle way she spoke to them, the protective positioning of her body even in the safety of his home. Wellington had settled near the fireplace, his bright eyes alert, but his posture relaxed for the first time since Thomas had found them. "Detective Harrison mentioned inconsistencies in your original statement to the Iowa authorities," Henrik said finally. "Can you explain that?" Sarah finished giving Daniel his milk before she answered. "When the constable came to the house that night, I was in shock. Benjamin was dead, there was blood on the hearthstones, and I was terrified they would take my children away. So I told them the simplest version I could think of, that Benjamin had been drinking and fell. I didn't mention the fight or the poker because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me. But later you told them the truth?" "I tried to," Sarah said, her voice growing bitter. "When they started asking more detailed questions and I realized they suspected me of murder, I tried to explain what really happened. But by then they said I was changing my story to cover my guilt. Benjamin's family had already convinced half the town that I had killed him for his insurance money." Henrik exchanged glances with Thomas. "How much insurance money?" $500, Sarah said. "Enough to pay off Benjamin's gambling debts and maybe have something left over to start fresh somewhere else. But I never got to touch it. The insurance company won't pay out while I'm under suspicion, and Benjamin's debts have been accumulating interest. Even if I'm cleared of all charges, there probably won't be anything left." The amount was modest by Henrik's standards, but significant for a young widow with 2 children. It was enough to provide motive for murder in the minds of suspicious authorities, but not enough to risk one's life and freedom over if there were other options available. "Tell me about your husband's family," Henrik said. "Thomas mentioned they have influence in your county." Sarah's expression darkened. "The Mitchells have owned the largest grain mill in the county for 3 generations. Benjamin's father, Judge William Mitchell, sits on the circuit court. His uncle, Mayor Robert Mitchell, controls most of the local businesses, and his cousin, Prosecutor James Mitchell, was the one pushing hardest for my arrest." "A family dynasty," Thomas observed grimly. "I can see why you felt you had no chance of a fair hearing." "They never approved of Benjamin marrying me," Sarah continued. "I was a farmer's daughter from the poor side of the county, and they made it clear they thought he was marrying beneath himself. When Benjamin started drinking heavily and gambling away money, they blamed me for not being a good enough wife to keep him in line. After he died, they were quick to assume I had finally decided to solve my problems with violence. Maria had been listening while she tidied the kitchen, but now she returned to the main room. "What about your own family, dear? Surely they would have supported you." Sarah's shoulders sagged slightly. "My parents died in an influenza outbreak 2 years ago. I have a sister in Oregon, but I haven't heard from her in over a year. Benjamin discouraged me from maintaining contact with my family, said they were beneath his station. By the time I realized I might need them, I had no way to reach them." The isolation was a common pattern, Henrik knew. Controlling men often worked to separate their wives from potential sources of support, making them more dependent and less likely to seek help when violence escalated. He had seen it before among the ranch families, and it never failed to anger him. "So you decided to head for California," he said. "Why there?" "I heard there were opportunities for women willing to work hard," Sarah explained. "Farming communities that needed teachers, or households that needed help. I thought maybe I could find some kind of life for my children there, somewhere Benjamin's family couldn't reach us." "A reasonable plan," Henrik acknowledged. "But poorly executed, if you'll forgive me saying so. Traveling alone with infant twins and no money was extremely dangerous." Sarah's cheeks reddened again. "I know it was foolish. But I was desperate, and I couldn't think of any other options. Every day I stayed in Iowa was another day they might decide to arrest me and take my children away." Henrik stood up and walked to the window, looking out over his prosperous ranch. The corn was tall and green, the cattle were healthy, and the buildings were in good repair. It was the result of 30 years of hard work and careful planning, but it was also the result of taking calculated risks at crucial moments. "Thomas," he said without turning around, "what is your assessment of the situation?" Thomas had been dreading this question, but he had also been preparing for it. "I think Sarah is telling the truth about what happened to her husband. I think she's exactly what she appears to be, a young mother who made a desperate choice to protect her children and is now paying the price for it. And I think if we send her away, she and those babies will end up dead on the prairie within a week. And if we keep her, and she is lying, if she is indeed a murderess who has deceived us all." Thomas looked at Sarah, who was watching this exchange with obvious anxiety. Emma had fallen asleep in her arms, but Daniel was still awake, making soft cooing sounds as he played with his mother's fingers. Wellington had closed his eyes but remained alert, one ear cocked toward the conversation. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," Thomas said finally. "But I'd rather be wrong about trusting someone than wrong about condemning them." Henrik turned back to face the room, his decision made. "Maria, prepare the guest room for Mrs. Mitchell and her children. Thomas, you'll need to ride into town tomorrow and telegraph my lawyer in Lincoln. I want him to research the legal situation in Iowa and advise us on Mrs. Mitchell's rights." Sarah looked up with surprise and hope. "Mr. Larsen, I can't ask you to involve your lawyer." "You didn't ask," Henrik interrupted. "I offered. And I don't make offers lightly." He studied her face again, then nodded as if satisfied. "You may stay here while this matter is resolved, with the understanding that you will be completely honest with us about everything. No more half-truths or omissions, even if you think they make you look bad. Can you agree to that?" "Yes, sir," Sarah said immediately. "I promise." "Good. Now, Maria will show you to your room so you can rest properly. Thomas, I want to speak with you privately about the arrangements we'll need to make." As Maria led Sarah and the children toward the guest room, Wellington limping along behind them, Henrik waited until they were out of earshot before speaking again. "Thomas, you realize what you've committed us to?" "I think so," Thomas replied. "We're sheltering a fugitive from justice and potentially interfering with a legal investigation." "More than that," Henrik said. "If Detective Harrison is correct and Mrs. Mitchell is guilty of murder, we're putting Maria and ourselves at risk. If he's wrong and she's innocent, we're taking on a fight with people who have money and influence. Either way, this could end badly for everyone involved." Thomas nodded slowly. "I know. But Henrik, I couldn't walk away. When I saw her in that cornfield with those babies, trying so hard to keep them safe, it reminded me of why you gave me a chance 12 years ago when nobody else would." Henrik was quiet for a moment, remembering the day he had hired Thomas Crawford. The man had been thin and desperate, carrying everything he owned in a single saddlebag, but there had been something in his eyes that spoke of integrity and determination. Henrik had never regretted that decision. "Tell me your honest assessment," Henrik said. "Not what you hope is true, but what you actually believe." Thomas considered carefully before answering. "I believe Sarah Mitchell is exactly what she claims to be. I believe her husband was abusive and that she killed him in self-defense. I believe she ran because she was afraid of a corrupt system, not because she was guilty of murder. And I believe that if we help her prove her innocence, we'll be doing something that matters. And if you're wrong, then I'll accept the consequences," Thomas said simply. "But I won't abandon her and those children to save myself from potential trouble." Henrik nodded, recognizing the stubborn integrity that had made Thomas such a valuable employee and trusted friend. "Very well. But we do this carefully and legally. No more impulsive decisions or unauthorized promises. Everything goes through proper channels from now on." "Understood," Thomas agreed. "And Thomas, if at any point I decide this situation has become too dangerous for my family, Mrs. Mitchell will have to leave, regardless of the circumstances. Maria's safety comes first." "Of course," Thomas said, though privately he wondered what he would do if that moment came. He had made a commitment to Sarah and her children, and breaking it would go against everything he believed about honor and responsibility. Over the next 3 days, a routine developed at the Larsen Ranch. Sarah proved to be everything she had claimed: hard-working, intelligent, and genuinely grateful for the sanctuary she had been offered. She helped Maria with cooking and housework, tended a small vegetable garden, and even assisted with some of the lighter ranch chores when the babies were napping. Wellington, meanwhile, had adapted to ranch life with surprising ease. The Peacock had claimed the barn as his territory and spent his days patrolling the yard with the dignity of a feathered security guard. His damaged tail was slowly growing back, and his limp was becoming less pronounced with rest and regular meals. Detective Harrison visited daily, as promised, conducting long interviews with Sarah about her life in Iowa, her marriage to Benjamin, and the events leading up to his death. Thomas was present for most of these sessions, partly to provide support for Sarah, but mainly to ensure that Harrison conducted himself professionally. The detective was thorough and skeptical, pressing Sarah for details about timeline, motivations, and inconsistencies in her story. But as the days passed, Thomas noticed a subtle shift in Harrison's attitude. The man was still suspicious, but he seemed to be taking Sarah's claims more seriously. On the fourth morning, Henrik's lawyer arrived from Lincoln. Jonathan Blackwood was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s who had built a reputation as one of Nebraska's most skilled criminal attorneys. He spent most of the day reviewing the documentation Harrison had brought from Iowa and conducting his own interview with Sarah. That evening, he joined Henrik, Thomas, and Sarah in the main room to discuss his findings. Maria had taken the babies for their evening feeding, leaving the adults free to speak candidly. "Mrs. Mitchell," Blackwood began, "I've reviewed the evidence from Iowa, and I have some observations that may be encouraging." Sarah leaned forward hopefully. "What kind of observations?" "First, the medical evidence supports your version of events. The coroner's report indicates that your husband died from a single blow to the head consistent with falling backward and striking the stone hearth. There are no other injuries that would suggest a prolonged struggle or premeditated attack." "What about the inconsistencies in her original statement?" Detective Harrison asked. He had been invited to attend the meeting as a courtesy, though his presence clearly made Sarah uncomfortable. "Perfectly understandable under the circumstances," Blackwood replied. Mrs. Mitchell was in shock, frightened, and dealing with the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event. The fact that she later provided a more complete account actually supports her credibility rather than undermining it. Harrison frowned, but she still killed her husband, whether she meant to or not. In Iowa, that could still be manslaughter. "It could be," Blackwood agreed, "but it could also be justifiable homicide if she was defending herself and her children from imminent harm. The key question is whether a jury would believe that she reasonably feared for her safety and the safety of her babies. What evidence is there to support that fear?" Henrik asked. Blackwood consulted his notes. "I sent a telegram to a colleague in Iowa City, asking him to investigate Benjamin Mitchell's reputation and history. What he found was illuminating. Mitchell had been arrested twice for public drunkenness and disorderly conduct in the past 2 years. He had significant gambling debts with several unsavory characters. And there are at least 2 witnesses who saw him strike his wife in public on separate occasions." Sarah's eyes widened. "People saw him hit me?" Mrs. Eleanor Crawford, the wife of a local merchant, witnessed an incident outside the general store 6 months ago. "And Dr. William Hayes treated you for a black eye and bruised ribs 8 months ago, injuries you claimed were the result of a fall, but which he noted were more consistent with being struck." Thomas felt anger surge through him at the thought of Sarah being beaten while caring for infant twins. Harrison, meanwhile, looked troubled as the implications of this information became clear. "If Benjamin Mitchell had a documented history of violence against his wife," Harrison said slowly, "and if there were witnesses to see him threatening her with a weapon on the night he died, then Mrs. Mitchell has a strong case for self-defense," Blackwood finished. "The question is whether the Iowa authorities are willing to consider that possibility, or whether they've already made up their minds." "What would you recommend?" Henrik asked. Blackwood was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his options. Ideally, Mrs. Mitchell should return to Iowa with proper legal representation and face the charges in court. If we can present the evidence of abuse and demonstrate that she acted in self-defense, there's a good chance she could be acquitted or at least have the charges reduced to something that wouldn't result in prison time. "And if the Mitchell family's influence makes a fair trial impossible?" Thomas asked. "Then we explore other options," Blackwood said diplomatically. "But we should try the legal approach first. Justice systems, even flawed ones, sometimes surprise you." Sarah had been listening to this discussion with growing anxiety. "Mr. Blackwood, what are the chances that they would take my children away if I returned to Iowa?" "Honestly? Significant, at least temporarily. If you're arrested and held for trial, the children would likely be placed with relatives or in an orphanage until the case is resolved." The thought of Emma and Daniel in an institution, or worse, in the custody of Benjamin's family, made Sarah feel physically sick. "I can't risk that," she said firmly. "Whatever happens to me, I won't let my children suffer for my mistakes." "Mrs. Mitchell," Harrison said unexpectedly, "what if I could guarantee that your children would remain with you during any legal proceedings?" Everyone turned to look at the detective with surprise. Harrison shifted uncomfortably under their scrutiny but continued. I've been thinking about this case for several days now, and frankly, the more I learn about your husband and his family, the less I like the way this investigation was handled in Iowa. What are you saying? Sarah asked cautiously. I'm saying that I have some influence with the authorities in Iowa, and I might be able to arrange for you to face questioning there under conditions that ensure your children's welfare is protected. It wouldn't be ideal, but it would be better than the alternatives. Thomas studied the detective's face, trying to read his motivations. Why would you do that? Last week you were convinced Sarah was a murderess. Harrison was quiet for a moment, then sighed. Because I have a daughter about Mrs. Mitchell's age, and 2 grandchildren about the same age as Emma and Daniel. And because I became a law officer to protect innocent people, not to persecute them. He turned to Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell, I can't promise you'll be cleared of all charges. The law is the law, and someone died as a result of your actions, even if those actions were justified. But I can promise you'll get a fair investigation and that your children won't be separated from you unnecessarily. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of the people who had become her unlikely allies. Henrik, who had sheltered her family despite the risk to his own reputation. Maria, who had cared for her children as if they were her own grandchildren. Thomas, who had vouched for her character based on nothing but instinct and faith. And now Detective Harrison, offering her something she had never expected, justice tempered with mercy. If I agree to return to Iowa, she said finally, what guarantees do I have that this won't simply be a trap to get me back into their jurisdiction? Blackwood spoke up. I would accompany you as your legal representative, and I would insist on specific conditions being met before you surrender yourself for questioning. Detective Harrison would be present as an independent witness, and we would have agreements in writing regarding your children's care. It's a risk, Henrik admitted, but it may be your best chance to clear your name and build a real future for your family. Sarah closed her eyes, weighing her options. She could continue running, but that would mean a life of constant fear and uncertainty for her children. She could try to disappear entirely, but that would require resources she didn't have and skills she hadn't developed. Or she could trust these people who had already done so much for her and face the consequences of that terrible night when she had pushed Benjamin Mitchell to protect her babies. When she opened her eyes, her decision was clear. I'll do it, she said quietly. I'll return to Iowa and face whatever charges they want to bring, but I want it understood that if this goes badly, if they try to take my children, or if it becomes clear that I can't get a fair trial, I reserve the right to leave and never look back. Agreed, Blackwood said immediately. I'll begin making the necessary arrangements tomorrow. As the meeting broke up and people began to drift toward their evening routines, Thomas found himself walking with Sarah toward the guest room where her children were sleeping. Wellington limped along beside them, his bright eyes alert in the gathering darkness. Are you sure about this? Thomas asked quietly. Once you cross back into Iowa, there's no guarantee you'll be able to leave again. Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him. In the lamplight from the house, her face looked young and vulnerable, but her eyes held a determination that reminded Thomas of steel. Thomas, for the past week I felt something I haven't experienced since before I married Benjamin. I felt safe, not just physically safe, though that's been wonderful, but safe enough to think about the future instead of just surviving each day. She gestured toward the ranch around them, peaceful and prosperous in the evening light. Your friends Henrik and Maria, they've shown me what a real family looks like. What it means to have people who support each other and work together toward common goals. I want that for Emma and Daniel. You could have that here, Thomas said, and immediately felt foolish for the obvious longing in his voice. Sarah smiled sadly. Could I? As a fugitive from justice, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering when the law would catch up with me. That's no life for my children, and it's not fair to the people who have been kind to us. She was right, and Thomas knew it, but the thought of her leaving, possibly never to return, created an ache in his chest that surprised him with its intensity. Somewhere in the past week, Sarah Mitchell had become more than just a woman he was helping. She had become someone he cared about deeply. What if something goes wrong? He asked. What if the Mitchell family's influence is too strong, or if the evidence isn't enough to clear you? Then at least I'll know I tried to do the right thing, Sarah replied. And my children will know when they're old enough to understand that their mother didn't spend her life running from the truth. They had reached the guest room, and Sarah paused with her hand on the doorknob. Thomas, I need you to know that whatever happens in Iowa, these past few days have meant everything to me. You saved my life and my children's lives, and you did it without asking for anything in return. I'll never forget that. Before Thomas could respond, she had slipped into the room, leaving him standing alone in the hallway with Wellington at his feet. The Peacock looked up at him with what might have been sympathy, then settled down for the night with a soft rustling of damaged feathers. Thomas walked back to his own quarters, but sleep was elusive. Instead, he found himself sitting by his window, looking out over the ranch and thinking about the choices that had brought him to this moment. 12 years ago, Henrik Larsen had given him a second chance when he desperately needed one. Now he was trying to do the same for Sarah Mitchell and her children. The difference was that Thomas had been alone when he started over. Sarah had 2 babies depending on her, which made her situation both more urgent and more complicated. If she failed to clear her name, it wouldn't just be her future that was destroyed. But if she succeeded, if she could prove her innocence and reclaim her freedom, then perhaps she could build the kind of life she deserved. The kind of life Thomas found himself wanting to be part of, though he hadn't dared to voice that hope even to himself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions. Detective Harrison would begin coordinating with the Iowa authorities, Blackwood would draft the legal agreements that would protect Sarah's rights, and Maria would start preparing for the possibility of saying goodbye to the children she had come to love. But tonight, for a few more hours, Sarah Mitchell and her babies were safe under the protection of the Larsen Ranch. Wellington was healing in the barn, Emma and Daniel were sleeping peacefully in clean beds, and their mother was resting without fear for the first time in months. Sometimes, Thomas reflected, that was enough. Sometimes the promise of safety, even if temporary, was worth whatever risks lay ahead. The courthouse in Council Bluffs, Iowa, stood like a monument to frontier justice, its red brick walls weathered by decades of prairie storms and human drama. Sarah Mitchell stood at its base 3 weeks later, holding Emma in her arms while Daniel clung to her skirts, both children fussing from the long train journey. Wellington perched in a specially constructed traveling cage, his bright eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with obvious displeasure. Thomas stood beside her, having insisted on making the journey despite Henrik's concerns about leaving the ranch during harvest season. Jonathan Blackwood flanked her other side, his expensive suit and confident bearing a stark contrast to the modest traveling dress Maria Larsen had sewn for Sarah during their final days in Nebraska. Detective Harrison approached from the courthouse steps, his expression unreadable. Behind him walked a man Sarah recognized with a sinking heart. Prosecutor James Mitchell, Benjamin's cousin, whose cold blue eyes held the same calculating intelligence that had made her late husband so dangerous when crossed. Mrs. Mitchell, Harrison said formally, thank you for returning voluntarily to address these charges. Detective, Blackwood interjected smoothly, I trust the arrangements we discussed have been finalized? James Mitchell stepped forward, his smile sharp as a blade. Mr. Blackwood, how generous of the Nebraska legal community to involve themselves in Iowa affairs. I assure you, we're perfectly capable of handling our own criminal cases. I'm sure you are, Blackwood replied evenly. However, my client has rights under territorial law that transcend county boundaries, and I intend to ensure those rights are protected. The tension between the two lawyers was immediate and palpable. Sarah could feel Thomas shift slightly closer to her, his hand resting near the gun he wore, despite being in town. The gesture was subtle but protective, and she drew strength from his steady presence. Judge William Mitchell emerged from the courthouse, his black robes billowing in the autumn wind. At 72, Benjamin's father remained an imposing figure, his silver hair perfectly groomed and his pale eyes as cold as winter ice. He surveyed the group before him with the detached authority of a man accustomed to controlling every situation he encountered. Counselor Blackwood, Judge Mitchell said, his voice carrying across the courthouse square, I understand you represent the defendant in this matter. That is correct, Your Honor, Blackwood replied, his tone respectful but firm. Mrs. Mitchell has returned voluntarily to address the charges against her, with certain conditions regarding her children's welfare that were agreed upon in advance. Yes, I've reviewed those conditions, Judge Mitchell said dismissively. Most irregular. But I suppose allowances must be made for the accused's circumstances. Sarah felt her cheeks burn at the barely concealed contempt in the older man's voice. She had known this would be difficult, but facing Benjamin's family on their own territory was proving even more challenging than she had anticipated. "Your Honor," Prosecutor Mitchell said, "if we could proceed with the arraignment, I have substantial evidence to present regarding the defendant's guilt in the matter of Benjamin Mitchell's death." "Actually," Detective Harrison interrupted, "there have been some developments in the investigation that the court should consider before proceeding." All eyes turned to the detective, and Sarah felt her heart begin to race. Harrison had been unusually quiet during the journey from Nebraska, spending most of his time reviewing documents and sending telegrams to contacts throughout Iowa and Nebraska. She had no idea what he might have discovered. "What kind of developments?" Judge Mitchell asked, his voice sharpening with suspicion. Harrison pulled a thick folder from his coat. "During the past 3 weeks, I conducted extensive interviews with residents of this county regarding Benjamin Mitchell's character and behavior. What I found raises serious questions about whether Mrs. Mitchell acted in legitimate self-defense." Prosecutor Mitchell's face flushed red. "Detective Harrison, you had no authority to conduct such an investigation without coordinating with this office." "I had every authority," Harrison replied calmly. "The death of Benjamin Mitchell remains an open case under my jurisdiction until formal charges are filed and accepted by this court. I was doing my job." Thomas watched this exchange with growing interest. Harrison had mentioned conducting additional research, but he hadn't shared the results with anyone, not even Blackwood. Whatever the detective had discovered, it was significant enough to risk challenging the Mitchell family's version of events in public. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion in chambers," Judge Mitchell suggested, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "With respect, Your Honor," Blackwood interjected, "my client has a right to hear any evidence that pertains to her case. If Detective Harrison has uncovered new information, it should be presented openly." Judge Mitchell's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. "Very well. Detective, what exactly did your investigation reveal?" Harrison opened his folder and withdrew several documents. "I interviewed 43 residents of this county, including merchants, farmers, saloon patrons, and church members. 31 of them reported witnessing Benjamin Mitchell engage in violent or threatening behavior toward his wife on at least one occasion. A murmur ran through the small crowd that had gathered to watch the proceedings." Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief and disbelief. She had known that some people must have seen Benjamin's abuse, but she had never imagined so many would be willing to speak about it. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, "I obtained medical records from 3 different physicians who treated Mrs. Mitchell for injuries consistent with domestic violence during the 2 years preceding her husband's death. Dr. William Hayes, Dr. Margaret Patterson, and Dr. Samuel Brooks all noted injuries that were unlikely to have been caused by accidents." Prosecutor Mitchell stepped forward aggressively. "Those records are confidential medical information that cannot be admitted without proper warrants and procedures." "Actually," Blackwood said, producing his own documents, "Mrs. Mitchell has signed releases authorizing the disclosure of her medical records for the purposes of this investigation. Everything Detective Harrison has obtained was gathered legally and with my client's full cooperation." Sarah stared at her lawyer in amazement. She had no memory of signing such releases, but then she remembered the stack of papers Blackwood had asked her to review and sign during their final meeting in Nebraska. She had trusted him to handle the legal details, and apparently that trust had been well placed. "There's more," Harrison said, his voice growing stronger as he sensed the momentum shifting in his favor. "I spoke with several of Benjamin Mitchell's gambling associates, including Marcus Webb and George Patterson. Both men stated that Benjamin owed significant money to dangerous individuals and had become increasingly desperate and violent in the weeks before his death." "Hearsay and speculation," Prosecutor Mitchell protested, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Sworn affidavits," Harrison corrected, producing more documents. Both men were willing to testify under oath about Benjamin Mitchell's behavior and state of mind. Judge Mitchell had been growing increasingly pale as Harrison presented his evidence. Now he spoke with barely controlled anger. "Detective, even if everything you've said is true, it doesn't change the fact that Benjamin Mitchell is dead and that this woman killed him. No, Your Honor, it doesn't, Harrison agreed. But it does establish a clear pattern of abuse and a reasonable basis for Mrs. Mitchell to fear for her life and the lives of her children. Under territorial law, that constitutes a valid defense against charges of murder or manslaughter. Thomas found himself holding his breath as the implications of Harrison's investigation became clear. The detective had done more than simply gather evidence. He had systematically dismantled the Mitchell family's narrative about Benjamin's death and Sarah's motivations. Additionally, Harrison continued, I located 2 witnesses who were near the Mitchell house on the night Benjamin died. Mrs. Eleanor Crawford and her son David were returning from a church meeting when they heard shouting and the sound of breaking glass coming from the Mitchell residence. Mrs. Crawford stated that she heard a man's voice threatening to, quote, teach someone a lesson, and a woman screaming for him to stay away from the babies. Sarah gasped audibly. She had no idea anyone had been close enough to hear what happened that night. The knowledge that there were witnesses to Benjamin's threats filled her with a mixture of vindication and terror. Blackwood stepped forward, sensing the moment to press their advantage. Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, I move that all charges against my client be dismissed. The evidence clearly shows that Mrs. Mitchell acted in legitimate self-defense to protect herself and her infant children from an abusive husband who was threatening them with deadly force. Absolutely not, Prosecutor Mitchell snarled. This is nothing but a coordinated attempt to smear the reputation of a dead man who cannot defend himself. Benjamin Mitchell was a respected member of this community, and his death demands justice. Justice, Blackwood replied coldly, requires that we consider all the evidence, not just the version that supports predetermined conclusions. Judge Mitchell looked around the courthouse square, clearly recognizing that the situation had spiraled beyond his control. The crowd had grown larger as word spread, and Sarah could see sympathy and support in many faces. The Mitchell family's influence was powerful, but it was not absolute, especially when confronted with systematic evidence of their son's violent behavior. I need time to review this new evidence, Judge Mitchell said finally. Court will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Until then, Mrs. Mitchell will remain in the custody of Detective Harrison under the conditions previously agreed upon. As the crowd began to disperse, Thomas approached Sarah with obvious relief. How are you holding up? I can't believe it, Sarah said, her voice shaking with emotion. All those people saw what Benjamin was doing to me, and they remembered. They were willing to speak up. Sometimes people just need someone to ask the right questions, Harrison observed, joining their conversation. I suspect many of your neighbors knew what was happening but didn't know how to help, or whether it was their place to interfere. Blackwood was organizing his papers with obvious satisfaction. Mrs. Mitchell, I believe we have an excellent chance of having these charges dismissed entirely. The evidence Detective Harrison has gathered establishes not only a pattern of abuse, but also witnesses to the specific threats that preceded your husband's death. What happens now? Thomas asked. Now we wait for Judge Mitchell to decide whether he's willing to dismiss charges against his own daughter-in-law or whether he's going to force this case to trial despite the evidence, Harrison said grimly. Either way, Mrs. Mitchell, you should know that you've already won the most important victory. What do you mean? Sarah asked. You came back. Harrison said simply. You could have disappeared into the territories and lived as a fugitive for the rest of your life. Instead, you chose to face the truth and trust in justice. That takes more courage than most people ever have to show. That evening, Sarah sat in the small hotel room Detective Harrison had arranged, feeding Emma and Daniel while Wellington preened his slowly recovering tail feathers in the corner. Thomas sat by the window, keeping watch over the street below, while Blackwood reviewed legal precedents by lamplight. Thomas, Sarah said quietly, what will you do if the charges are dismissed tomorrow? Thomas looked up from his vigil. I reckon I'll head back to Nebraska and finish the harvest. Henrik's been patient, but he needs his foreman back. And after that? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Sarah to her children to the Peacock that had become such an unlikely part of their strange family. I suppose that depends on what you decide to do. You'll be free to go anywhere, start any kind of life you want. Sarah settled Daniel in his makeshift crib and sat down across from Thomas. I've been thinking about that. If the charges are dismissed, I'll have access to Benjamin's insurance money. It's not a fortune, but it would be enough to buy some land, maybe start a small farm. Where were you thinking? Thomas asked, though his tone suggested he was afraid of the answer. I was thinking Nebraska might be a good place to raise children, Sarah said softly. I hear there are opportunities for people willing to work hard. Thomas felt his heart stop and restart. Nebraska's a big territory. Whereabouts in Nebraska? I hear Buffalo County has some excellent ranches, Sarah replied, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. And I know someone there who might be willing to help a widow with 2 children learn the farming business. Before Thomas could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Harrison entered, his expression serious but not grim. Mrs. Mitchell, I've just spoken with Judge Mitchell, he said. He's asked to see you privately in his chambers tomorrow morning before court convenes. Is that normal? Blackwood asked suspiciously. No, it's not, Harrison admitted. But under the circumstances, it might be our best opportunity to resolve this matter without a trial. Sarah looked around the room at the 3 men who had risked so much to help her. What do you think I should do? I think, Thomas said slowly, you should listen to what he has to say. You've come this far by facing the truth. No point in stopping now. The next morning, Sarah found herself sitting across from Judge William Mitchell in his private chambers, a wood-paneled room filled with law books and the weight of decades of legal decisions. The old man looked tired and older than his years, the events of the previous day having clearly taken their toll. Mrs. Mitchell, he began, his voice lacking its earlier arrogance, I want you to know that I loved my son, despite his difficulties. Sarah remained silent, unsure how to respond to this unexpected vulnerability. Benjamin was not an evil man, Judge Mitchell continued, but he was weak, and weakness in a man can become dangerous when combined with drink and desperation. I knew he had problems controlling his temper, but I told myself it was temporary, that he would outgrow it. He was threatening my children, Sarah said quietly. I couldn't let him hurt them. Judge Mitchell nodded slowly. I believe you. Detective Harrison's investigation was thorough and painful. I had no idea how many people knew about Benjamin's behavior toward you. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the town his family had helped build. Mrs. Mitchell, I could force this case to trial. I have the power to do that, regardless of the evidence in your favor. But it would destroy what remains of my family's reputation and accomplish nothing except prolonging everyone's suffering. Sarah felt a flutter of hope in her chest. What are you saying, Judge Mitchell? The old man turned back to face her. I'm saying that the charges against you will be dismissed this morning. The official record will state that Benjamin's death was the result of justifiable homicide in defense of yourself and your children. Relief flooded through Sarah so powerfully that she had to grip the arms of her chair to keep from falling. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me, Judge Mitchell said heavily. I'm not doing this out of kindness. I'm doing it because it's what should have been done months ago, before you were forced to flee your home and live like a fugitive. He sat back down and looked directly at her. Mrs. Mitchell, I failed my son by not addressing his problems when they were manageable, and I failed you by allowing my family's influence to cloud my judgment about what really happened that night. I can't undo those failures, but I can prevent them from causing more harm. Sarah stood up, feeling lighter than she had in months. Judge Mitchell, for what it's worth, I'm sorry about Benjamin. I never wanted him to die. I know, the old man replied. And, Mrs. Mitchell, when you rebuild your life, wherever you choose to do it, remember that you have the strength to survive anything. You've already proven that. An hour later, Sarah walked out of the courthouse, a free woman, her children in her arms and her future spread before her like an open prairie. Thomas was waiting at the bottom of the steps, his face breaking into a grin when he saw her expression. It's over? He asked. It's over, Sarah confirmed. The charges are dismissed. We're free to go. Wellington chose that moment to let out a triumphant cry from his traveling cage, his damaged but healing tail feathers catching the morning sunlight. The sound seemed to announce to the world that justice had been served and that some stories, against all odds, have happy endings. 3 months later, Thomas Crawford stood on the porch of a small but sturdy farmhouse 15 miles south of the Larsen Ranch, watching Sarah hang laundry while Emma and Daniel played in the dirt yard under Wellington's watchful eye. The Peacock had made a full recovery and now patrolled their property with the dignity of a feathered guardian angel. Sarah had used Benjamin's insurance money wisely, purchasing 80 acres of good farmland with a house, barn, and well. Thomas had left Henrik's employ with the older man's blessing and good wishes, and now worked Sarah's farm while courting her with the patience and respect she deserved. It wasn't a conventional courtship, by any standards. They were practical people, facing practical challenges, building a life together based on mutual respect, shared values, and a growing love that had been forged in the crucible of crisis and tested by fire. As Sarah walked toward the house carrying the empty laundry basket, Thomas stepped forward to help her up the porch steps. She smiled at him, the wariness that had defined her features for so long replaced by contentment and hope. "Any regrets?" he asked, as he had taken to doing during their quiet evening conversations. "None," Sarah replied as she always did. "Well, except maybe one." "What's that?" Sarah gestured toward Wellington, who was teaching Emma and Daniel to search for insects in the garden. "I sometimes wonder what our neighbors think about the family with the peacock who found each other in a cornfield." Thomas laughed, pulling her into his arms. "I think they probably figure we're exactly where we belong." And as Wellington let out his characteristic cry and the twins giggled with delight, Thomas Crawford realized that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most perfect endings. Because courage doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. Sometimes it shows up as quietly as a woman sleeping in a cornfield, protecting what matters most and trusting that tomorrow will bring the chance to build something better. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.